Okay, well, thank you for all of the housekeeping issues. And tonight's speaker then is an amazing person that I just got to know tonight, Susan Wilburn. And she is here to help us understand the global framework of chemicals, plastics, pollution, the World Health Organization, because she started her career back at Kent State. She got her bachelor's in nursing in Kent State, Ohio, her master's from the University of Washington in Seattle, and then she's an occupational and environmental health nurse consultant at the International Council for Nurses in Geneva, Switzerland, where she has just sold her apartment after living there for 11 years. So I'm not sure you needed to sell your apartment, but or should have sold your apartment. But we're very glad to have you here. And she's been the director of the World Health Organization and the ICN's work in preventing needle stick injuries, for example, and occupational exposure to HIV/AIDS, and also coordinating healthcare without harm. So she has done a lot of international work on healthcare, nursing, and of course, having started your career as a nurse in the critical care units and all of that hard work that nurses do for us every day if we have to go to a hospital. So, Susan, come share your experiences with us, and let's give her a round of applause.
Thanks, Nina. Thanks very much. Thanks, Tony, for letting me know about the Olympia World Affairs Council. And I'm curious about, since many of my friends have come tonight, how many people are here at an Olympia World Affairs Council event for the first time? It's great that you're here. Thanks for coming. And I've been to a few of these events and have been really interested at the caliber and the content of information that's been shared. And I want to set time.
Oh, and Susan, we'll take questions at the end of your presentation. Okay.
Okay, good. So as Nina said, I'm going to talk about the global framework on chemicals for a planet free of harm from chemicals and waste. I'm also going to talk a bit about plastics and the plastics treaty that is to be finalized later this summer. But so this is the outline of my presentation. I'll talk about how I first got interested in these links between health and the environment and what that link is, a bit about the global burden of disease related to environmental factors, health impacts of chemicals, and then I'll dig into the global framework and the plastics treaty, and talk a little bit at the end around your questions about what we all can do, what you can do to protect yourself from hazardous chemicals and the hazardous chemicals in plastics. But I'm going to start to talk a little bit about myself, that this beautiful sunset picture is Lake Erie a year ago, which is where I grew up. But when I grew up, it was during the time of the picture on the left. This is the burning river, the Cuyahoga River. Interestingly, though, it was 1969 that the Cuyahoga River caught fire from the industrial waste coming down the river from all of the steel plants that have now closed, almost all in Cleveland. And this picture was in the Smithsonian magazine, but it's really not a picture from 1969. They put it in the Smithsonian magazine in 1969 to illustrate, because there were no photographs of the burning river in 69. This is from 1952. So the Cuyahoga River had burned many times before. And in this particular 1952 incident, they had 3 warehouses that burned, 2 tugboats that burned, and I think nobody died. So there was some good news. And so when I was a child, growing up on Lake Erie, we had to take the dead fish off the beach as we wanted to go into the water to swim. So I kind of grew up knowing about pollution as normal, but that stimulated in 1969 the work that led to the 1972 Environmental Protection Act that was signed by President Nixon at the time. And so the experience I had with pollution then became transformed post 1973 with the implementation of the Environmental Protection Act and the EPA, the administration, to clean up Lake Erie, quite like how Lake Washington in Seattle was cleaned up, and it was rather contaminated for a long time. But now the lake is beautiful. We can eat the fish again. There were fish advisories when I was a kid, so that although I wasn't Catholic, we used to go every Friday with the Catholics to eat fish. And for a number of years, that was stopped by fish advisories because of the contamination in the lake. Again, though, now there's great perch, there's great walleye, and the lake is clean enough, although there's issues with hazardous algae bloom as a result of fertilizer from farmers in Michigan, Ohio, and Canada on the lake. So one more thing about that, part of the contamination was from mercury, part of it was from polychlorinated bisphenols from the manufacturing of steel. The mercury, later on, I became a nurse, and I was using mercury fever thermometers, mercury measuring devices for blood pressure, sphygmomanometers. And it was when in 1976 that the US EPA published research that showed one of the top 2 causes of mercury contamination in the United States was medical waste incinerators and the disposal of mercury that we were using to care for and protect people. So it became an epiphany for me where my work as a nurse and my interest in the environment came together, and it became a privilege to do my work for the last over 20 years. Then another area to make this connection between health and the environment, now not a human health issue, but the health of this beautiful great blue heron. What you see in this picture is my houseboat down in Percival Landing, and the other picture is the other end of the dock facing the Capitol, that these beautiful, majestic, prehistoric-looking birds, because of the pesticide DDT, the birds' research demonstrated, and actually it was research done on golf courses in Washington State that showed that the eggs that were laid by the birds were thinning as a result of DDT. So when we banned DDT, also the result of the EPA, which, as we know, has been drastically weakened in the last month or so, the birds came back, and we have in Olympia heronries now over by the farmer's market, where we have the benefit of watching these beautiful birds. So I learned about pollution being normal, and I also learned that when you stop pollution, things recover. And it became a hopeful message to look for solutions. I thought I would do just a quick cruise through my experience. This picture is from the World Health Assembly a few years ago. I'm standing in front of a diorama of the global burden, sorry, not the global burden of disease, of the Sustainable Development Goals, those 17 goals that were adopted by the General Assembly of the UN in 2015, also known as the 2030 Agenda. And so I'm just pointing at health, goal number 3, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But starting from the bottom, when I was in the coronary care at the US Public Health Service Hospital in Seattle, and started working my way into global health through the Citizen Democracy Corps in Warsaw and Poland, and then at the International Council of Nurses, and finally at the World Health Organization. For the last year and a half, I've been consulting in my retirement on issues related to climate resilient and environmentally sustainable healthcare services. This slide demonstrates that 25% of the global burden of disease is the result of environmental exposures. And this research that was published in 2006 by the World Health Organization really helped people wake up about the opportunity to, as the publication indicates, to be able to prevent disease through healthy environments. And again, it's more an example of what we can do when we act to reduce and prevent pollution. Here's a picture of the World Health Organization and a picture of smallpox immunizations as we have eradicated smallpox, and hopefully will stay that way. This is how I used to travel to work when I lived in Geneva and cross the border every day on my bicycle. And you can see in the background the largest mountain in Europe, Mont Blanc, which is the same size as our mountain, Mount Rainier. So I felt right at home most of the time, even though 40% of the people that live in Geneva, Switzerland are expatriates and speak about that many languages. In May of 2023, the World Health Assembly, that meets every May in Geneva, passed a resolution requesting WHO to advocate to address, work with other sectors, environment, health, agriculture, labor, trade unions, to address pollution, recognizing that, among other things, air pollution was causing 8 million deaths annually, many of those deaths among children. And that to address pollution, to both identify, prevent, treat, and treat the health impacts. So help prevent pollution to protect health. And recognizing that the health sector, which has been my work for over 20 years now, has been a contributor to that pollution. And so therefore, WHO should work together in the health sector to lead by example. And one of the ways that WHO has been leading around the issue of pollution and chemicals is through the development of this roadmap on chemicals. In February, the executive board of the WHO met to agree that they're now in the process of revising this chemical roadmap, and I'll be on a meeting next week with them to talk about how civil society wants to be more involved in its implementation. But it talks about why it's important for the health sector to be involved in management, addressing the risks related to chemicals, and also that this idea that the health sector is 10% of the global economy needs to lead by example, to demonstrate to the energy sector, to demonstrate to the agriculture sector the importance of eliminating highly hazardous pesticides for health, the benefits of stopping our addiction to fossil fuels. And there's all sorts of action areas and networks that WHO has organized globally around the assessment, evaluation, and risk reduction related to chemicals. And I just took a sample of 3 of the Sustainable Development Goals in their relationship to the global framework on chemicals and WHO's work on chemicals, and those 3 being good health and well-being, obviously, climate action, and number 12, which is responsible consumption and production, and looking at how we use our purchasing power and how we manufacture products in order to protect health and promote health. There's at least 4 other of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals that are not up there that are related to this work. So I'll ask you afterwards who can name those 4 goals. I said that the chemical roadmap was how WHO was contributing to this global framework on chemicals. This is an international environmental instrument that was adopted in September of 2023, so not quite 2 years ago. And I participated in the negotiations throughout the previous 5 years to get this instrument finalized. What's really interesting, if you know about environmental conventions like Basel, Rotterdam, Stockholm, Minamata, Those are environmental conventions. This global framework on chemicals is unique in that it's an instrument, not a convention, but it includes many sectors. So the health sector is a part of it. The labor sector and the International Labor Organization sits at the table to participate in negotiations and implementation. The ministries of environment around the world, organized by UN Environment Program, are there, and Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO, and agriculture ministries. So all of these ministries, for the best way possible, which is not, as all of us know, it's very challenging to work across sectors. It's fairly challenging even to work with the people that are in the office across the hall with you. So when they all get together and agree to something, it's quite incredible. And the work of the global framework in implementation programs is talking about how we identify priority chemicals of concern and then work to phase them out, and work to phase them out in the supply chain from extraction to manufacturing to transport to use to end of use and disposal, preferably reuse. And to think about how to get supply chains to provide information so we can know, for example, what are the chemicals that were used to treat the textiles that we're all wearing, and what those health impacts are or potential health impacts from those chemicals, and to also then promote innovations in green chemistry and sustainable chemistry, and to begin to manufacture benign by design. We're also looking at the supply chain in terms of those manufacturers that are creating hazardous chemicals. What is their responsibility? What is their responsibility to take back? What is their responsibility to pay for the damages caused by their products? There was a meeting today in Geneva of what's called the Executive Board of the Global Framework on Chemicals Fund. And the fund, in part, is contributed to by many governments, but it's also contributed to by the international chemicals industry in order to recognize that they need to support the protection of people from the damage caused by their chemicals. So what are we talking about when we're talking about priority chemicals or chemicals of high concern? And I thought it would be useful just to spend a minute or two to think with you about what we know about hazards that result from chemicals. So we all know about carcinogens, but often we don't sort of remember the link that carcinogens cause cancer. And so carcinogenic chemicals are related to various different types of cancers. They're not, the same chemical doesn't cause breast cancer versus colon cancer, but there's a relationship. And that relationship is defined by the International Agency for Research on Cancer, which is a sub-agency of the World Health Organization, also in Europe, but not in Geneva. And I put this photo of a fetus just to help us recognize that the most vulnerable populations and the first environment, if you will, is the fetus's environment in a pregnant mother. Mutagens, these are chemicals that cause birth defects. And a lot of time you'll see an abbreviation that says CMRs, and that means carcinogens, mutagens, and reproductive hazards. But if you buy anything from California and you see the label that says this has to be identified, classified as part of Proposition 65 on labeling hazardous chemicals and products, you'll see the CMR listing. So mutagens cause birth defects. Reproductive hazards can either be reduced sperm count, an ability to get and maintain a pregnancy, early miscarriages as a result of reproductive hazards. Neurotoxins, and in a minute I'll talk a little bit more about neurotoxins, because mercury, which galvanized my work in this area of health and environment is a potent neurotoxin. Endocrine disruptors, the endocrine system in our bodies regulates digestion, among other things. So endocrine disruptors can cause immune problems. They also can contribute to the development of diabetes. And then there's sensitizers and asthmagens. So those things that cause people to wheeze, to develop asthma or other pulmonary diseases. So as we're thinking about chemicals of concern, these are the chemicals that cause these health problems that we want to prevent exposure to, we want to manage, or better yet, substitute for less toxic. Here's a picture of nurses in the Philippines in advance of the Minamata Convention on Mercury. The Minamata Convention on Mercury called for, among other things, the end of the use of mercury-containing medical measuring devices by the year 2020. This picture was taken before that. These were pioneering nurses in the Philippines that were working to phase out mercury-containing medical devices, and you can see they're holding up non-mercury thermometers that they have piloted and trialed, and non-mercury blood pressure measuring devices. So mercury is a potent neurotoxin. You can see on the slide the various health impacts. It can change your gait. It can change your ability to learn. It reduces IQ. And as I was, as part of WHO on the team that was providing technical support during the negotiations of the Minamata Convention on Mercury, we were talking to a lot of non-health people from ministries of environment, because it was at first exclusively environmental convention. And so having to find ways to popularize what a neurotoxin is for people that don't have a background. And I would just say, you know, we can't really afford to have any of our children have reduced IQs, which will happen from mercury contamination. And it's true that a mercury fever thermometer, if you break it and spill that mercury, can contaminate a lake the size of Ward Lake. Not as big as Lake Erie, takes a lot of mercury to do that. And mostly that was through mercury and coal-fired power plants, that the air pollution from those incinerators, including medical waste incinerators, is what contaminated Lake Erie with mercury. I think that's... I'm going to talk about only 3 other chemicals of concern, and there's tens of thousands of them. Polyvinyl chloride is a particular concern because it is so widely used in healthcare settings. And polyvinyl chloride is a plastic. I'll talk a lot more about plastics in a few minutes. It's a problem in that it creates dioxins when it is manufactured and when it is burned, when it's incinerated. And regardless of how high temperature the incinerator is, it will produce dioxins. Dioxins are a known human carcinogen, and they're also an endocrine disruptor. So eliminating the use of PVC is one of the challenges in healthcare settings, and an important challenge that we have to work on. Same with also this carpeting is likely has PVC-backed tiles underneath. I'll tell you an example of how Kaiser Permanente went out in an experiment to find carpet tiles that were going to be the same price and able to be cleaned like regular carpet tiles that you need in a hospital, and did not have PVC backing, and they succeeded in doing that. The other thing about dioxins, as you see on screen, is that it's lipophilic. It means that it dissolves in fat, and it means that it is more persistent not only in the environment at large, but in human bodies. And so those fatty tissues in our bodies, like breast milk and breast tissue, really concentrate dioxins. The other issue related to PVC is that if you have the polyvinyl chloride in itself, it is very brittle. And you saw a picture in the opening slide of IV tubing. that is flexible. In order for PVC to become flexible, you have to have an additive that's generally a phthalate. And the most common one, the most common plasticizer to make PVC flexible is diethylhexylphthalate. This is a picture of a parenteral nutrition tube, a tube that you stick down your nose and into your stomach to give you hyperalimentation if you are unable to eat or unable to swallow. And this tube, the DEHP can leach out of the tube so that the tube, if you leave it in for a long time, becomes brittle again. Same with an IV. If the IVs are left in for a week, they start to get stiff because the phthalate, the diethylhexylphthalate, is leaching out into the individual. And the issues related to phthalates that have leached out into individuals is that there's an increased risk of reproductive hazards, undescended testes among boys, and other issues that have been identified by the FDA, by Health Canada, and have been banned for in Europe in toys. This is the sort of last slide about this toxic plastic, which is made, of course, out of fossil fuels and petroleum products. Here's a picture from East Palestine, February 2023, so 2 years ago now when the train derailed. You can see this is the day of the train derailment. This is a year ago. I was visiting this site, which happens to be 40 miles from where I was born. I was born in Youngstown, Ohio, and this is just downstream from Youngstown. So they had this spill of vinyl chloride monomer, which incidentally is used to produce PVC IV products, along with many other products. And this is now a year after the spill where the cleanup is not even partially done. So these pipes are draining the stream that runs alongside the railroad tracks where all the people were evacuated. If you remember this, you'll remember that the company owner of the train system, in their wisdom, decided to light it all on fire. So there was a huge explosion, and the smoke and the pollution went into nearby West Virginia and Pennsylvania from Ohio, where this accident occurred. And this is one of the many tanks that's storing the fluid from the stream, which they've emptied out because of its contamination, so they're continuing to test it. And I'll talk a little bit more about the health effects from fossil fuels and plastics during manufacture and transport, but this is a vivid example. It was in 1996, I mentioned that the US EPA published the advisory that showed that that medical waste incineration was one of the top causes of mercury pollution. At the same time, it was the second dioxin assessment done by the US EPA, and it showed that the number 2 cause of pollution, air pollution with dioxins in the United States, was the result of medical waste incineration. So this organization where I ended my career, Healthcare Without Harm, was formed with this mission to transform healthcare settings so that these pollutants that we learned about in the United States could be stopped. And within 2 years of the formation of Healthcare Without Harm, they band together with the US EPA, the American Hospital Association, and the American Nurses Association, where I was working at the time, to form a group called Hospitals for Healthy Environments and to assist hospitals in implementing what happened in 1997 was the first air pollution control regulation in the United States that applied to medical waste incinerators. Prior to 1998, when it was implemented, hospitals had a humanitarian exemption so they could pollute. And this has been true in many ways going forward, that healthcare settings claim that they must use a toxic product or they must be able to pollute. And so over the course of 3 years' time, Healthcare Without Harm had helped to close 700 medical waste incinerators in the United States and find alternative treatment technologies. It was started in the United States based on that evidence of the impact of hospitals and healthcare settings on pollution, but pretty much immediately became a global organization and started. So my last job before retirement was to be the sustainability director of this global green and healthy hospitals network, where you can see that Healthcare Without Harm had hospitals that were active to become more environmentally responsible and sustainable in 86 countries. I didn't get to all of those hospitals, but I've been to quite a few. Now I'm going to talk about plastics for most of the rest of my presentation. And this is the cover of a report from the Center for International Environmental Law, CL. They're based in Washington, D.C., and also Geneva and Switzerland, about the links between greenhouse gas emissions and plastics manufacturing and plastics disposal. And the plastics that contribute to global warming are at all stages of the life cycle of the production of plastics, from the oil and gas extraction, refining and manufacture, from use, and then from end of use, or in this case, single-use plastics disposal, and how they end up in the streets, in our homes, in the landfills, and in the ocean. Microplastics are another significant issue that I'm sure many of you have been reading about, that there have now been tests of placenta, and every time there have been tests of microplastics in placenta, every single placenta sample has microplastics. Another place where we all are exposed to microplastics is if we drink bottled water, that you can see on average there are 240,000 microplastics in bottled water. And I'll talk a minute about some of the health effects, but I don't think any of us imagine that they're nutritious or that we want them. And it's also a reminder, and I took a peek today at the annual water quality report of Thurston County of Olympia. The water quality that comes out of our taps is way better quality than what you get in a plastic water bottle. So it's just another reminder of why we want not to be buying water in plastic bottles. Okay, plastics are everywhere. They're ubiquitous in healthcare settings. And I raised this here because I was in the negotiations for the Plastics Treaty a year ago in Ottawa, Canada, where there were posters that said plastics save lives. And in a poster, there was a baby receiving an IV from this IV bag, which is polyvinyl chloride, the toxic plastic, that the promoters of, well, the manufacturers that were trying to prevent a strong plastics treaty from being negotiated were there to say, exempt healthcare settings. And this is one of the things that's really important about WHO's role in places like environmental treaties. WHO has come to the table starting in the third negotiating session of the Plastics Treaty to say, do not give healthcare an exemption from the Plastics Treaty. We know that we need to reduce single-use plastics in healthcare settings. And more important, we need the innovations that will be thwarted if we're exempt. If healthcare has to produce, then the innovations will move forward. So there's a question. They're ubiquitous, but are they essential? The increase in the use of single-use plastics, which is much more extreme in the United States than in anywhere else on the globe. And we can really learn a lot from our colleagues in Latin America and in Southeast Asia that are reusing glass products, not using single-use. And I'll give an example or two of that in a minute. But this idea that we can prevent and control infections by using single-use products is part of what's driving it forward and the hysteria around infection. We have an infection prevention and control expert in the audience. I'll be curious to hear more about your thinking. But you can see that in plastics audits that have been done by the Global Green and Healthy Hospitals, starting in Southeast Asia, replicated in Europe and in Latin America, Brazil, and in Europe, in the United States, show that 22 to 83% of the waste stream of healthcare settings is plastics, depending on the setting, depending on the specialty, like the surgical setting or the operating room has a lot more. And unfortunately, dietary settings have a lot of unnecessary single-use plastic. And what are we doing with our plastic? We're trying to ship it to Southeast Asia. It was about 10 years ago that China, who was accepting our plastic and reprocessing it, said, you know, the plastic that you send us from the United States is just too dirty. You know, that you send us plastic that has junk on it still, and we can't handle that. So we're not going to accept your imports anymore. So now they're going to Malaysia, they're going to Philippines, and where 950 million tons were exported, where are they landing? In the ocean. And it is the marine environment that stimulated the development of the Plastics Treaty, in part because of a mariner, a woman from England who was sailing around the world and seeing plastic and happened to have enough wealth to start funding research that stimulated work that then the UN Environment Assembly 3 or 4 years ago now said we will have a legally binding plastics treaty. Just back again to this idea of the essential need of single-use plastics in healthcare. This is an article, a recent article from the Journal of the American Medical Association, published by infectious disease and anesthesiology experts, Jody Sherman, who is from Yale, Hardeep Singh from the National Health Service in England. And so looking at, while there are some applications where single-use devices, preferably ones that are re-sterilizable, may be necessary, but the unfettered, irrational adoption of disposable items in the name of infection control is harming us all. One of the places we know where there are a lot of unnecessary single-use plastics is that of personal protective equipment. I think I saw this picture all over the world, including in the streets of Olympia. A mask dropped on the street. During COVID, we were all masking up, mostly single-use products, although colleagues in Texas, in fact, learned how to get new kinds of masks that could be reprocessed. They did also really effectively in India. Missing a slide. So chemicals in plastics. You can see in this slide that there's more than 13,000 chemicals. This is a report from UN Environment Program. And among that 13,000 chemicals that have been identified in the manufacturing of plastics, not many of them, about half, have been studied for their health concerns. So there's been studies of 7,000, and among the 7,000 that's been studied, over 3,000 have hazardous properties. So they're not inert materials. They are affecting us. And the health risks come from both the plastic, the chemicals that leach out, as well as the bacteria. My mother had a number of hip and knee replacements in her time and had infections in her knee replacement. And part of the reason is that her total knee was made out of plastic that was made for a very, very nice atmosphere environment for infection. And it took 3 years to cure the infection that kept recurring despite having 3 knee replacements in the same knee. Plastics, more recent, this is a study that was published in the Journal of the American College of Cardiology in the United States about the cardiovascular problems related to plastics. And here's more information about phthalates, the plasticizer, DEHP, and how it causes thickening of the coronary arteries, contributes to coronary heart disease, how it contributes to high blood pressure. And also in the case of bisphenol A, BPA, this is the chemical that's in styrofoam cups, increased risk of diabetes. Really very scary research that's been quite effectively done. So this is a publication, again, from the Center for International Environmental Law, looking at the different ways we are exposed to hazardous chemicals from plastics, whether it is the pollution from manufacturing and transport. We saw the train that turned over, from the refining and manufacturing, consumer uses, and all of the different ways that we can either inhale, ingest, swallow, or have skin exposure to plastics. And then during waste management, as I mentioned, burning of plastics causes, among other things, dioxins. What you have also, I'm sure, been hearing as part of the plastics treaty negotiations is that, oh, we're doing a great job recycling plastics. And this is an article from the Guardian, the UK newspaper, that companies were lying to us about their recycling. They were saying we're recycling, when in this evidence from the OECD, what we see is less than 9% of plastics are truly recycled. And the segregation of plastics and the having single monomers of a type of chemical of the plastic is the only way you can really recycle a plastic so it's not toxic. So this slide, you can see in the green at the very end, there's Canada and US are at the top of the screen. The green is where recycling really occurs in proportions. You can see a lot of landfilling, this dark in the middle, and the incineration is the deep purple. And then there's this mismanaged or thrown on the street, thrown in the river, thrown in the thrown in the ocean use of plastics. So it's very important for us all to challenge when we think or when we're told that plastics can be recycled. I'm going to switch now, before I talk about the plastics treaty, to talk about this group of chemicals that you've been reading about and hearing about. Also, everyone writes that, any journalist that writes about them calls them forever chemicals. What does it mean to be a forever chemical? It means it's persistent in the environment. It means it doesn't have, its half-life is long, and that they stay around for a long time. So PFAS, a forever chemical, is a whole class of chemicals that is used in our favorite non-stick fry pans, Gore-Tex, water repellent clothing, lots of cosmetics, firefighting foam. And there are not great alternatives yet, although over there is my raincoat that I bought in Europe that is made from a non-PFAS water repellent. Yeah, it's good for bicycling. You don't get hit quite so often. The hazards from these forever chemicals: liver and immune system damage, birth defects, developmental disease, and an associated risk of cancer. This picture on the slide is from a demonstration in France. France has just banned the use of PFAS in many applications, but not in nonstick pans. So the Tefal Corporation in France organized a lot of "don't touch my pan" protests, and they were effective. So let's talk about some of the solutions and examples that people have been doing to eliminate or reduce single-use plastics and plastics in general. These are work of Healthcare Without Harm. This in the center is a whole variety of work that's been done in surgical settings in the United States, where the circle are those reuse of sterilizable containers instead of plastic disposable, reuse of medical products, changing the way that the kits that the surgeon pulls off the shelf when you're having surgery that are reformulated so they're more unified, and how to reprocess what's called single-use devices, but there is the US FDA, and also there are permissions in Europe to reprocess single-use products. And it's kind of like, you know, the pull date when you get a bottle of milk or something at the store that really is about 3 to 6 weeks later. There's a lot of devices that the companies want you to buy a new one, but are perfectly good for reprocessing up to 100 times. And in this case, this one hospital per each operating room saved $20,000 per year in doing these efforts. Here's a hospital, one of the largest hospitals, private hospital in Cali, Colombia, and they have been working with Global Green and Healthy Hospitals to eliminate all of these hazardous chemicals. We'll talk a bit more about triclosan, which is now implemented in Washington State in the Safe Cosmetics Act that came into force on January 1st. Triclosan is an additive, or I would say a contaminant of soap. Many mothers have been convinced that their children will be safer if they have triclosan additives in their soap, completely unnecessary and an endocrine disruptor. So this hospital has been working for years to eliminate these chemicals. And another example is from the same hospital is they had these anesthesia masks that were PVC. They switched to a less toxic plastic, a silicone mask, and you can see the automated device for sterilization. And they reduced the amount of waste significantly. They could reprocess this 100 times, and they saved, in this case of this product, $20,000. Another product they were using made of PVC that they switched to silicone. They saved $200,000. So that's quite a lot of patient care. Here's an example from a children's hospital in London, Great Ormond, where the nurses got together and said, we're using way too many single-use medical gloves. And one of the things that happened during COVID is that people started wearing gloves for everything, including unnecessarily to give the COVID vaccine. And the World Health Organization, the United States CDC, and the Infection Control Africa Network all said you do not need to wear a glove to give an injection of an immunization. But I'm guessing many of you here, when you had your COVID vaccine, experienced the provider wearing a glove. And I've said to them when I have been in the setting, don't wear a glove, you know, high touch is so much more therapeutic than through a glove, besides which it's not necessary. And I started carrying around with me the CDC guidelines that said don't use a glove, because they said, oh, the boss says I have to, it's part of our guidelines, you know, I'll get in trouble. And I'm like, okay, introduce me to your boss. Let's see if we can do something. Well, the nurses at this hospital did a whole campaign to contradict and raise awareness of the unnecessary use of gloves. One of the issues that was interesting is that these exam gloves came in a box to dispense them, and you would pull out one, and I see Liz, who's a physician assistant, knowing how you think you pull out one and 15 fall to the floor, and now you've just wasted 15 gloves. So they changed the way that they were delivering these gloves in this hospital. They changed the whole process of decision-making about who's protecting whom from what. You know, is it me protecting you? I'm your nurse. Is it me protecting me because I don't want to get infected by whatever you have? So they did a whole lot of training on understanding infection control. They saved 21 tons of plastic and over $100,000 in 1 year. And those nurses from that hospital then rode their bicycles from London to Glasgow, Scotland for COP20, I think it was COP26, when the Committee of the Parties about the Paris Agreement occurred in Scotland. They went to advocate that climate is a health issue after doing this major success. Here's an example from the Philippines. I mentioned earlier how much we have to learn from our colleagues in Asia because they didn't have the money to buy all these new products. They learned how to reuse them. But they banned styrene foam, so bisphenol A is no longer in their cafeteria. They had the staff bring their own spoons and forks. A benefit, but they also chose a plastic container that was a single-use polyethylene material as opposed to a combined material or mixed with polycarbonate, so they could recycle them. And syringes, interestingly, a few years ago, syringes used to be a mixed material product, and they have now reduced, they've made the polycarbonate so they can be reused. Another example from our friends in British Columbia, these compression devices, which were disposable, they found a way to implement reusable ones, and they saved $6 million in a year and diverted 60,000 products. UCLA stopped using plastical gowns that were disposable and replaced them with cloth gowns that you can wash. Last couple of things to talk about are the Plastics Treaty. The Plastics Treaty negotiations that started in 2022 are going to complete in August of this year at the final negotiating session. There are, amongst the civil society and health activists, these demands that it's a strong treaty, that we don't exclude healthcare, and that we ensure that the chemicals in plastics are transparent and that the toxins, so we don't have legacy toxics where people are recycling plastics, occur. This year, 2 major acts in Washington state have come into force. The Safe Products for Washington and the Toxic Free Chemicals Act, they both were adopted in 2019 with a 6-year roll-in period. And you can see PFAS, or forever chemicals, are eliminated from stain and water-resistant treatment in carpets and rugs, bisphenols in drinking can linings. This Washington state, you may know, is quite a bellwether for environmental regulation. Really important leader, not only in Washington state, not only in the United States, but the European Union now is looking at a ban of PFAS, and they're studying Washington regulations for that purpose. Usually, environmental regulations, usually environmental regulations in Europe are much stricter and more effectively adopted and enforced than they are in the United States. But here's Washington state is a great example of where that is less true. And the Toxic Free Cosmetic Act, I was talking about triclosan. You can no longer add it intentionally after process. So some of these contaminants like lead may still be available in some cosmetics, but not if they added. And it's interesting, mercury. And I haven't looked myself in the state of Washington, but in Geneva, Switzerland, where mercury is not allowed to be in cosmetics, I have found it in the market as skin lightening. So, and in Asia, babies who are browner than we are, because of racism, are getting skin lightening creams. And the last solution, good example, is that of Kaiser Permanente. And Kaiser has all of these stewardship goals related to climate and food and waste reduction. They've worked to establish organic farms that provide food for Kaiser hospitals in the Oakland area. And they have, as one example, environmentally preferable procurement criteria. And this is the list of the chemicals that their suppliers that 50% of the products they buy have to meet all of these restrictions in chemicals in those products. And this is, again, not only important for the Kaiser Permanente system, but this list of chemicals was adopted by the largest group purchasing organization in the United States, Vizient, that buys for the veterans hospitals and buys for a number of systems. But it was also then adopted by, it's now a part of a European phase-out list, this identical list. So a list that was started by Kaiser almost 20 years ago now has taken flight around the world and is in discussion for the creation of a global chemicals of concern and healthcare list for potential phase out. And there's a lot of successes in the implementation of this phase out list in Kaiser settings. I will leave you with the slides that will have a variety of websites where I find useful and effective materials. I'll just mention one thing. The Collaborative for Health and Environment is a group that does an analysis of chemicals that cause various different health impacts. They do webinars, they do beautiful, very scientific work, and their website is very interesting to work at. Have you seen this boat? Well, let me go back. Thinking about how to think global and act local, and how to think local and act global, and looking at the hierarchy of what can we eliminate, detoxify, and refuse, and reuse and reprocess before we waste, and what you can do personally in eliminating bottled water, in having frying pans that are cast iron and stainless steel instead of having nonstick, as well as what can you do as leaders in your communities, in your organizations to set policy, whether it's procurement policy or policy about recycling, to advance this work, and how we can all support local government. Local government, when the previous Trump administration pulled out of the Paris Agreement, local mayors and governors, including Jay Inslee, came to the Paris Treaty negotiations, the committee of the parties, saying, we're still in. This happened also at the plastics negotiations last year when the US federal government was weak because they were representing industry more than human health. A lot of regional governors came to the plastics treaty negotiations to say, we want a strong treaty. We need to support our elected officials to maintain the work that is happening already in Washington State. And I'll do my best in my role as a member of the Bureau of the Global Framework of Chemicals to spread the word that it is possible and that when we reduce pollution, people get better. Thank you, and I think we have some time for questions.
Thank you, Susan. Excellent, excellent information, and touches my life personally in so many ways, because as we all have been getting older, we go to the hospital sometimes now, more often, or doctor's offices, and I have noticed how much waste there is. And so this was really helpful to know that I'm with Kaiser. So thank you. Anyway, I have a microphone. I'd be happy to bring it around the room. If you raise your hand, I'll bring the microphone so we can all hear your question. Tony, here you go.
Thank you so much, Susan, and thank you in particular for talking about solutions. That's refreshing these days to know that there are some solutions and some things that work. I'm curious, one of the things that I've been hearing, and I'm wondering if you're seeing this in the negotiations and so forth, you mentioned the lobbying by various organizations. I'm seeing indications that the big petroleum companies are recognizing that their days may be numbered in selling petroleum for the purposes of combustion, and that they're pushing very hard on chemicals as the new market. Do you see a lot of that present in the negotiations?
Yes, I see both the petroleum industry coming to the climate treaty and trying to buy governments that will vote in their favor against any source reduction. And yes, the chemical industry, and there's another report that I didn't show from the Center for International Environmental Law about how the companies that are making plastics have been supported by the petroleum industry and where they're creating new markets. And the market in medical devices alone is supposed to grow by 40 million between now and 2030. So it's an opportunity that they're trying to seize upon.
Yeah, I'm going to ask it back here for the person on Zoom. So Jean asks, in doing some research on PFAS, I came up upon the Madrid Statement of PFAS, which was created in 2014 at an International Dioxin Symposium. Do international statements like this make any difference at all?
Great question.
Anybody hear that? Yeah. Do those statements make any difference at all?
They make a lot of difference. In the Paris Agreement in COP26, it was the first time that WHO and the UK government put forward a climate and health component to the Paris Agreement. It's saying that climate is a health issue. It was in 2028 that 42 million health professionals showed up in force to say climate is a health issue, and it made a huge difference. So the way that those statements are used is how they make a difference. It's when they get brought into negotiations, but they're, you know, the article from the Journal of the American Medical Association about the unnecessary use of single-use devices for infection control, we have been using that very effectively to educate how and engage with infection control providers who are fairly conservative. So working in many ways, those kinds of things are effective.
There's another question way in the back here. Here you go. I'll hand this to you.
Actually, I have 3 questions. I'm going to follow up to a previous question, which mainly the petroleum versus climate change activists. Who's winning currently? The good guy's winning. Please, I need some hope right now.
I don't know. What do you think?
I see. Thank you.
I think there's been a lot of progress at the last COP, and the next COP, COP30, is in Brazil, and Brazil has been quite a leader. So, and there's been a lot of work behind the scenes with governments leading up to the COP30 in Brazil. So I think we'll see some progress, but we just had a study published that the French government is preparing for 4 degrees. You know, we're at 2 degrees now. 3 degrees is not habitable in many places in the world. And France is doing emergency planning for what they think is going to happen.
I see. Secondly, so it's not very well known, but during the first Trump administration, roughly 2,000 chemicals got through the EPA due mainly to interference from the executive branch with their functioning by installing administrators who pressured scientists into not doing proper review work, even if when they wanted to, especially when they wanted to. During the Biden administration, was there ever any effort made to review that list and do the cleanup necessary after a Trump administration?
I don't know.
Okay.
Good question.
And thirdly, 3D printing, additive manufacturing, and the use of basically home devices to manufacture with plastic. I think that there is a interest, because it's decentralized manufacturing, in doing more responsible plastic management. But I don't think the tools are available for that. Is there any programs currently looking to make that more broadly available, to make a more direct recycling route from leftover parts to reusable plastic? And also, are there any good health guidelines for people who do additive manufacturing at home?
I know Lego is doing this effectively. I don't know very much about the very slick make things on your computer at home, nor about what the materials are, but I would be happy to look it up for you.
Thank
If you
you.
give me your contact, I'll do a little deep dive. I'm
Great.
guessing that our colleagues at the Center for International Environmental Law will have a beat on that, or maybe the Basel Convention, the Basel Action Network group out of Seattle may.
Okay, very good questions. We'll follow up with you on that. There is a question at the very front and another one on Zoom, 2 questions. I think you're first and then Oscar is next. And then there's a Zoom question.
Yes, is your group addressing the use of pesticides and herbicides in ag and food production? And how does that relate here?
Yes, great question. Within the group in the United States of the hospitals in the network, it's called Practice Green Health. They have a whole initiative, both on less meat, better meat, so related to greenhouse gas emissions from cattle, also working in agroecology and looking at no-till practices that improve yield that you need less fertilizer for. Anders was asking me if I ran into a group he used to be involved with called the Pesticide Action Network, and they're globally working very hard. And as part of the global framework on chemicals, one of the resolutions is the creation of a global alliance to eliminate the use of highly hazardous pesticides. And you may or may not be surprised that the Food and Agriculture Organization has not been quick to move on that because of what's called crop life industry of pesticide manufacturers. But there a lot of work in partnership because people are using pesticides for suicide. And so eliminating any use of highly hazardous pesticides is important to protect farmers and to protect our food.
Given the ubiquitous nature of microplastics, is there anything or any way to scrub to remove them? And if not, will we just wait until they disappear and are not replaced?
There is some work happening in Denmark on the, I don't know if I would call it scrubbing or what I would call it, but we may, well, I think you and I are not going to suffer from this as much as our grandchildren.
Another question back here from Zoom.
Zoom. All right. So this is from Whitney. My son's school serves school meals with single-use plastic utensils. In your opinion, what is the most effective approach to promote change on this issue?
I would meet with the head of the dietary. I would give them the examples, probably from the Healthy Hospitals food programs are also some connection to nutrition programs. There's an interesting program in Europe in school cafeterias that is run by, it's a government group on environmentally preferable purchasing. And again, I can probably give the link to the World Affairs Council to give to the colleague on Zoom. But I would start by talking with the dietary colleagues, but then talk with the other parents and organize around this effort. You know, what happened when I was in college is they switched to plastic because people were stealing the dishes out of the cafeteria. And I know a couple hospitals that went to use the most ugly dishes possible that could be washed and solved the problem that way. I know I used to like the trays for sledding, but I went to college in Ohio, so we had good snow there.
And you might just recommend that they bring their own utensils like one of the hospitals did. But I don't know, they might lose the forks and knives. I don't see any other hands raised, but I would like to make two plugs. I don't know if all of you know about Ridwell in this county, but I have learned to recycle multi-layer plastic bags and single-layer plastic bags. And they take a lot of different things, which included the Teflon pan that I just gave them. So I replaced it with another one, though. That's very unfortunate. So I'm feeling guilty. But the other thing to know is to continue to let our elected officials know what we're learning and what we're thinking about, and keeping the message alive. Because they have so many other issues that come to them. The only way they know that we're concerned is to keep letting them know. And it's pretty easy to get in touch with our legislators. So